Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 157. Today we're talking about Ionic. We are your hosts today, Justin Barrow, Danny Blue, and Leon Revel. Danny, Leon, hello.
Hey,
Hi.
Justin.
So sorry that I missed last week. I was in the midst of giving a talk because sometimes you have to talk off the microphone. And it's hard. But I missed you guys. I missed them all, and we're missing them all now. Maul is in a meeting as well because sometimes you got to go to a meeting. But this week we're not talking about meetings. We're talking about Ionic. And instead, but before we talk about that and introduce our guest this week, we're going to throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thank you, Justin. So first of all, the core tech powering StackBlitz is now being made open source. So this includes the magic which allows you to install NPM packages within the browser. Firefox 59 has just been released, and this includes some improvements to WebRTC, graphics rendering, some performance improvements, and plenty more. There's a new TC39 proposal, which has just been submitted, object.from entries, which allows you to create an object from an array of key value pairs. A minor version of Vue.js has just been released. That's version 2.5.16, and it includes various bug fixes. If you want to get the latest and greatest, then go and check it out. Node version 9.8.0 has just been released, so head over to the release notes to find out more. And finally, NPM has announced a new CLI command, which is npm CI, for faster, more reliable builds to be used as part of continuous integration deployment processes. And that's everything for me for This Week in Web.
Thank you, Leon. Some interesting stuff going on in the web this week. I'm particularly excited about from entries. It'll be an interesting way to sort of deal with array and key pairs. But we're not just talking about arrays. Sometimes you want to loop through them all day long. No, today we're talking about Ionic, and we want to welcome our guest this week, Mike Hartington. How you doing, buddy? How's it going, Mike?
Oh, hey, how's it going?
I think we're doing all pretty well. Danny, Leon, you guys doing well?
As good as can be expected.
I'm fine. Thank you, Justin.
Nice. Good job, everyone. It's a Wednesday and we're winning. Mike, for those out there who haven't heard about you, tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
All right. I'm Mike Hartington, developer for the Ionic framework, GDE as well, for those who care about that stuff. I basically work on the framework, make commits to it as well, but also do a lot of speaking, training, and blogging about everything mobile web components, web technology, just all of it.
Yeah, you're usually on the circuit of things, Mike. I think the last time I saw you were roaming around Chrome Dev Summit, screaming to the heavens about web components. But I think we're all screaming to the heavens about web components. I feel like that's every now and then. It's just a normal sort of thing. So there may be some listeners out there who don't know what Ionic is. Maybe a brief overview of what Ionic is. Maybe, if you want, I can put on historical background music for you. As well, but just maybe a little bit about Ionic.
For sure. So Ionic is a framework for developing both native mobile apps for iOS and Android, but also for generating PWAs or progressive web apps that load as traditional websites. There's a framework side of it, which is a whole bunch of UI components and controls that you would normally get from a native development kit. And then there's paid services for helping native development by managing your SDKs and also managing live code deploys whenever you need them. So that way you don't have to deal with App Store review processes.
But I like wasting so much of my time in the App Store review process, Mike. What will I do with that spare time now?
I don't know. I mean, you could, add new features to the web. You could listen to your favorite podcasts. One maybe called the Web Platform Podcast. Look at that. A fun little plug.
Inside of the show.
Plugging the show inside the show. I am on board with this.
That's like a fourth wall break inside of a fourth wall break. That's like 16 walls.
It's good that we're all reliving the plot line from Interstellar. I think that's the general gist at this point. Why there's so many walls? Gravity.
Oh man. So Mike, so the last time we talked at all about Ionic on the show, we were actually talking about something related to Ionic. We were talking about Stencil. So assuming Stencil is probably going to come up in some of the conversation later, can you also give a brief overview about what Stencil is?
Sure. So from like a super high level point of view, Stencil is a API or compiler that allows you to generate vanilla web components, but in a much friendlier manner. So for those who have never written like a vanilla web component, it can be quite verbose and pretty low level. Stencil comes in as a few syntactic sugar in the form of decorators on top of web components. And after it runs through the compiler, we're left with 100% standard compliant web components, just having all of the finer details managed for you.
Awesome. And so Stencil is also the underlying technology being used to write kind of the next generation of UI controls and things for Ionic, correct?
Right. So we went through a period of time where we were solely tied to frameworks like Angular. And we decided that we want to move to a more framework agnostic landscape. So this has led us down the road to build Stencil. And it's been pretty successful in converting all the components from Angular to web components with Stencil.
So does that mean that we are if some folks start digging around the documentation, they might see some things that reference Ionic Core and Ionic Angular. So are they so if the UI components are totally separated out, what is the Ionic Angular package?
Right. So so just to kind of like recap, there will be a package called Ionic Core. This is essentially all of the core components, no framework bindings, just whatever you want to use inside of a browser without a framework. There's also a package going to be called Ionic Angular. And this adds all the framework-specific features that Angular users would need. So it adds a lot of the providers and injectables for working with things like modals, alert controllers, toast. But then it also adds things like form directives. That way we can actually work with reactive forms or ng model inside of our controls. So wherever it needs to be some kind of framework level, there's going to be an accompanying package that would add that to the core.
Awesome. And then I have one more Angular related question, then I promise I'll stop.
No worries.
But I also saw that some of the more updated stuff, this doesn't mean that Angular is being abandoned by any means. So I also saw there was a recent blog post that also mentioned that it was actually moving closer to the Angular ecosystem for the Angular stuff, like using Angular CLI and the Angular router. And my question for that is, it's really not meant to be a jab, but like what took so long? What took so long to move from a custom setup to something like this, to the CLI and the router? Like, were those things just not ready at the time when you started working with it?
What
and
took so long
getting there?
It's a really long question. So first, I just want to say, you read my blog post. Yay. That makes me happy. Someone actually read things that I write. I guess to get at this, with the move to the Angular ecosystem, we're relying a lot on the framework because Ionic itself is going to start existing in this kind of framework agnostic approach. We decided that we should step back from like a lot of the framework specific things such as routing and the tooling, and let the frameworks actually let the framework tooling actually do its own thing. Why it's taken us so long to get this way is we were shipping a lot of this before this tooling actually existed or was out of a beta or alpha phase. For example, the Angular CLI didn't really exist in some usable form when our CLI was already shipping and using our own custom build processes. But now that the CLI actually works and is, quite good, there's no need for us to ship our own tools and then, kind of have to catch up to whatever the Angular CLI team is doing. Same thing with the router. We shipped our nav controller or our own internal routing system because we didn't think that URL routing was going to be quite effective, especially on mobile. And also the routing story inside of Angular wasn't fully finished. We had gone through several router iterations, starting with the component router to router 2 to the third router. And now, the final form of the router that exists, not to jab at Angular, but we had our router working. And now that we're going to be moving to the more framework agnostic approach, our nav controller and our navigation system is just going to be a thin layer on top of the Angular router. So that way you have all of the features that come with it, but can work with the same API that Ionic users are familiar.
So now Ionic is kind of moving to more of a kind of framework agnostic approach. Obviously, that means that the idea is that hopefully people are going to start using Ionic UI components and stuff with other frameworks, I assume. Could you speak a little bit more about that story or share on some of the plans around that area?
For sure. So, yeah, we're hoping that other frameworks or other users, other people who are using different frameworks, will want to come in and use Ionic, use Ionic's controls with, say, maybe Preact or React, but also Vue.js because that's becoming quite popular. Where I've done a few test demos and sample apps that are using Vue and aside from, some navigation quirks here and there, without us really having to do anything, Vue.js, we can just give them the web components and it handles it without any issues. The only real framework or library that actually has issues is React, and that's just because of its lack of support for of great support for web components. But hopefully that will be changing as time goes on.
That's really cool. So as you already mentioned, Ionic has some stuff on top of some of the framework features in Angular, for example. You said you kind of put some stuff on top of the Angular router. Is there a plan then to do something similar for some of the other frameworks? Or are you hoping that it's going to be so agnostic that it's just going to work and you're not going to need to do any of that kind of stuff?
That's a really good question. I wish I knew the answer. It's just so early that we probably don't have all the answers for, say, like React or Vue. Because we've been so focused on Angular for the past couple of years, we're trying to get the Angular story at least figured out 100% first, and then start to dive into all the different other details we'll need for frameworks. So that way we can just focus on what our users are using currently, and then start to explore the different options.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cool.
So would you say that the goal is to hopefully not have to provide any of your own kind of glue to make it work? That I guess the like the high level goal is you would want anybody to be able to take these things and just drop them in.
Yeah, I mean our goal has always been that we are a company who's just worked really hard at making good UI. And we've seen that frameworks come and go, and one of the best ways to deal with that is to just bet on the web standards, because those kind of stick around for a long time. And by dealing with that, we can just kind of move up the abstraction chain let the frameworks deal with whatever they have to deal with, and Ionic will just kind of come in and do its own thing. Hopefully we'll get to a point where, we don't have to write our own framework specific bindings. But for the foreseeable future, that's going to be something that's needed.
Cool.
The interop story has gotten quite a bit better now in terms of the API footprint that sort of the web provides. And I mean, you've seen that in sort of y'all's move to sort of this new sort of approach to building things with Ionic. I mean, realistically, I'm sure, no one wants to be the next MooTool smush debate online of interop stories in 10 years.
Come on, no one wants to be part of Smooshgate?
I feel
the t-shirts.
I feel like everyone wants to be part of Smushgate, but the problem is that should everyone be part of Smushgate? Like, and by the way, I don't know, did someone term it Smushgate, or did you just come up with that, Mike? Because that is brilliant.
No, I am not smart enough to think of that. There are more clever people that have thought of that before me.
I will say that I was somewhat disappointed because I had not been on Twitter much that week, and I legitimately had no idea what in the world everyone was talking about. I was like, why are we talking about smushing things? Like, I was very confused.
For
But
anybody that
in terms
doesn't
of-
know about Smooshgate or anything that was just mentioned, just go to Twitter and look it up, and you'll find out.
I'm sure we'll have an episode about that soon, because apparently we should all talk about how you name things in programming. But the interop story, things like this happen with the web, where all of a sudden things of the past come back to bite us into the future of things when we want to move forward, even though, getting away from naming and everything else, just the general way APIs work. Do you all feel that with the current state of the APIs and sort of building at things like Stencil and saying that we want to have this interop story with a wide range of frameworks is somewhat doable today? Because there seems to be a lot of debate around the notion that, well, the APIs just aren't ready, or they're not mature enough and they don't do these really specific things that I need them to do. Or, they're always, excuses have a tendency to pop up. But how do you all feel about it? Because it seems to me that you believe that the platform now, the state of the APIs, is in pretty good shape.
Like most answers that you can give with software development, it really depends. I think that the platform and the web APIs that we have today can cover mostly everything. There are a few cases, though, where, it'd be nice if the platform added things like DOM operation batches. Like if it was able to batch out mutations in one request instead of having to do all these dynamic updates. Things like virtual DOM. I wish that was in the browser. This is kind of one of the good things about Stencil, is that it'll add all of that in there without you having to really worry about it. So where the platform doesn't kind of cut it, Stencil can kind of come in and just, again, decorate on top of that without you ever having to know about it.
And there's a lot of debate these days around the nature of the build step, because obviously Stencil uses decorators and that requires a build step. And then you've got, there's been some comparisons online that I think we've all seen them over the course of, if you've, spent any time in a forum or a thread somewhere, where, oh, look at the small amount of code that I am required to write to do this, because I may not either understand what that code actually does and the way the build step works, or B, just the nature of what existing APIs are there. Do you feel like the build step is I think it's a given in most larger contexts, just the nature of the way we build and deploy things, but is it an accessible step, do you think? Even outside of the Ionic stuff, I mean, is a build step sort of the nature of the way the web should, or possibly is just going to go?
I hope for a future where build steps, if they do exist, are vastly simpler than what we currently have. I think what we see a lot is build steps are becoming so complex because all of our frameworks and all of our APIs are quite complex. But I hope for a time where if there is a build step, like it is dead simple. It's basically just make this file that I wrote smaller and more compact, like minify it. Because I think that the browser build step should have stopped with grunt. Don't at me. But I think
I'm sorry. I'm laughing behind because I'm like, you're going to get so many ats on the Twitters.
Yeah, I mean, I think build steps are a necessity because they solve a lot of things like code splitting for lazy loaded routes. That's going to require some kind of build step. In reference to like stencil components, we have a build step so that way we can lazily split out all of the components and load them in as they're needed. I do think that we'll get to a point where things like ES modules are shipping in the browser everywhere and are so reliable that we won't have to worry about bundling everything and shipping a module loader. We'll just have to rely on whatever the platform offers.
The story, I think the story does. The ES module story seems to be clarifying now, as opposed to the notion of split bundling and everything else. I think again for building bigger things, it's always going to get complicated. Me personally, I've decided to go back purely to make files. Like I'm just I'm out. I'm just yes. I'll make files all the time.
You have no idea how happy that makes me. Make files, call it a day.
And the interesting thing is I think there's probably listeners out there who've never used make files, and you know what? It's fine. You don't.
What's make?
No, I don't know what. I've never used a make file.
Exactly. Yeah.
You've never lived.
Yeah, but with the sort of way with all these sort of different approaches to being able to build for the web. I mean, the one thing that sort of set Ionic apart for a lot of years is your guys' documentation. Your documentation is pretty fit and fin, really top notch on the scale of I can actually get work done by reading it, as opposed to I don't know who wrote this documentation and I don't know what your project does. How are you how is the approach going to be with so much interop now? Because I think the one issue is that once you start to have the interop story, you end up having to either write or collect a lot of additional documentation. I mean, have you guys started to think about, wow, we're going to have to document this for 75 different libs or frameworks rather?
So first off, thank you, because I worked a lot on the documentation myself. Bunch of people also on the team, but that was my main focus for 6 months. So that's good.
It's one of the most underrated jobs, I think, in software development, honestly. And
it was a pain.
Yeah, right. It's not simple to do. And if you're out there writing documentation, we personally salute you. We really do. It's significantly important to be able to get work done with the things that everyone wants to build.
Exactly. So for the different framework aspects, we've been thinking about it ever since we thought that we could break away from just one framework, and currently we have our own documentation generating tool, which will extract everything into its simplest form, where it's properties and methods and events. So we think that we can document them in a clear enough manner, and then also provide the small framework specific examples that are needed when they are needed. So, for example, one of our components is an infinite scroller or a pull to refresh. It has a bunch of different properties that you can set on it to customize the text that is displayed when the user is pulling, the icon, and then a text that is shown whenever when the actual request is being happened. But then it also has an event that's emitted when you are pulling to refresh. If we document those in a generic enough way, where it's this is the event that is emitted, these are the properties that you can set on the element, properties or attributes, whatever you want to call them. We think that developers should have enough knowledge around the specifics of a framework that they should be able to go, okay, these are event binding syntax for Angular, or here are the event binding syntax for React or Vue. But we may add specific examples for like the top 3 famous frameworks and go from there.
So traditionally, Ionic, a while ago, when you thought of Ionic, it was generally a kind of a framework and a set of UI components for building, hybrid applications. And obviously, you guys have been working on some amazing projects, and Stencil being one of them. But there's also something pretty new called Capacitor. I was hoping you'd be able to talk a little bit about what that is, what kind of stage it's at, what its goals are, etc.
Sure. Capacitor is in the same spirit as Cordova or PhoneGap. It is a way to write native apps that are loaded on the device, but have full access to web APIs and also device APIs through a series of plugins. One of the things that Capacitor does different is its idea of how the native tooling works, and that is it relies a lot, for those who are familiar with native development, it relies a lot on Swift on iOS. It uses CocoaPods for dependency management. It does a lot of more modern tooling on the native side that tends to be a little less error prone. From another perspective, it also treats the native targets as things that you'll actually commit to Git or to your version control system. It doesn't treat it as something that it will end up getting thrown away whenever you push to your Git servers. We think that this will also cut back a lot on different issues. Different issues that pop up every now and then currently. But it also changes around how you would actually build out features. So, for example, a great one is geolocation. For Capacitor, the geolocation plugin merely is a wrapper around the web's own geolocation API. The only bits in the native layer that actually exists really just check for permissions and then manage it out that way. We think moving with this kind of web API first and then native when it needs to be added will end up being a lot better for the web. But it also takes it a few steps further. We recently, from a community member, added support for building apps with Electron that has the same APIs for geolocation, file storage, in an Electron-friendly manner. We'll add the same things for building first-class PWAs, also using Capacitor. That will also just compile down to calling Navigator, get media devices for accessing things like cameras.
This sounds amazing. So just to get in a little bit into the details, so how does it work in comparison to Cordova? So obviously a Cordova-based application, you've got a native app which has got an embedded web view, and then you have the concept of installing plugins, which basically include a bit of JavaScript, which knows how to call out to the native code and access native functionality. How does it work in comparison to that? Or is it similar to that, or kind of a different idea entirely?
It's actually pretty similar to that. It's a really good idea and a pretty nice pattern to work with. Our approach has been a bit different in terms of the way that bridge and API is created on the native layer.
Okay, cool. And I've also noticed that on the GitHub kind of README, it says that you've got support for existing Cordova plugins. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have a dev who is working on that mostly for all of his time, because we do realize that Cordova has been such a big feature in the web and people are going to be hesitant to want to move off of that. So if we can add support for some of the most common Cordova plugins, this will eventually allow people to migrate over to Capacitor, and then eventually just build out using web APIs.
So for all of these different plugins, or I'm not even really sure exactly what you want to call them, for these different features that Capacitor is going to offer, is the plan for every single feature that is offered, whether it's camera, geolocation, or anything like that, that it will have implementations? They will all have implementations for all of the platforms that you support, meaning so Android, iOS, Electron, and web? Or will you have some that's like, oh, this is here's one, but it only supports iOS because it does some iOS specific thing? Or is the whole goal of these capacitor features to be the same, to be something that will run on any of these platforms?
Yeah, it'll be the same that runs on any of the platforms. So for camera, on Android, it'll call out some native code to actually handle working with the camera system. For iOS, it'll do the same thing, calling up the camera APIs that exist in native iOS development. And then on the website, it will have a little bit of additional code that'll allow you to use the same Capacitor plugin API and then spit out the same camera experience that you would get on both iOS or Android.
So I imagine that one's actually probably a little bit more complicated, because the camera experience on web is fine for simple stuff, but it is not the same as on native.
Right.
But I guess my question was also more of, would you ever ship one of these features that only supported a single platform?
I mean, I don't think so. I like to think that we'd be supporting all the platforms that we do support. So at least from our side of it, if it's going to be a core capacitor plugin, it will support all the platforms that we support. Once you get into things like third party, then it kind of becomes stories like, well, does the third party developer have experience with that particular platform? But for all the core plugins, it'll support iOS, Android, eventually Electron, and also the PWA story as well.
So I've got a couple of questions. First of all, I suspect that when you build these features, and you obviously want these individual features to work over all of the different platforms, I suspect there'll be a preference to using the native web APIs, because obviously, if let's use I can't even think of an example. Let's use a geolocation, an example that you used earlier. If you've then got to obviously then write the iOS code and the Android code and then the Electron code, and then you're going to have something in the browser anyway, then because obviously using a web view, if you just use that code in the browser across all of those different platforms, and you've only got one thing to maintain, will that be the kind of plan, is to obviously take precedence of the web-based APIs, so then obviously you're not having to write as much code across all of the different platforms? Is that going to make sense?
It does. I guess it really depends on the API that you're trying to code for. For example, geolocation. When you're trying to load up a web view inside of Chrome, and then you try to call the geolocation API, you'll get permission errors because you're trying to access device information from an unsecure origin. Go figure that Chrome considers the file origin unsafe. But with that, we have to have some kind of native abstraction there that will deal with all those permission errors and work around it, but still honor the original web API and its intent.
Yeah, obviously you'll always need to plug the holes in the web APIs and make sure you can harness that native power. Which makes a lot of sense. Second question is how expandable and pluggable will this kind of ecosystem be for other people wanting to maybe overwrite or improve on stuff you've already added? For example, let's say there's a piece of functionality and a particular company wants to enhance it, add more features, and use more of the native platform. Is that something which would be possible with Capacitor, or is it more of a kind of closed ecosystem?
It will be open up for customizations. Specific examples of how this would be done, though, I think it's still pretty early to see what that story would be. So we'll find out as we develop it further.
Yeah, it's probably worth mentioning actually what kind of stage the Capacitor project is in.
Yeah, so Capacitor itself is still pretty early. We're in a very early alpha. We figured, though, let's announce it early enough and see what brave developers are able to do with it in its current shape and form, and get feedback, see how they think about it, what improvements can be made to the entire experience, and what bugs might exist.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to check it out. I mean, we at work we use Cordova quite heavily, and we found ourselves having to build the same functionality for Electron as well. So obviously, something like Capacitor, which targets the different device-based platforms, and also Electron as well, sounds very promising indeed. And you mentioned PWA support as well, so that's quite exciting. Would you be able to talk a little bit about that?
Nothing currently set in stone, but I guess the idea is more that with the PWA support, it would allow you to just use the same Capacitor API, and then it would call out the native web APIs that exist. So camera, so for example, the camera, you would, instead of calling navigator get media devices, you would just call Capacitor plugin .camera.take picture, and it would handle out calling out the other code under the hood. So it really is more just a way to normalize the API across all the different platforms and have the experience be the same.
It is amazing to me just how far the web has stretched in terms of places that you don't think the web is, and then you realize, yeah, my native apps are actually built on top of the web. Like, that's always shocked me, like in the course of the sort of progression of things, but whether it's your Cordovas or your PhoneGaps of the world to things like Electron. I mean, does the PWA story change that, you think? Do you think that, all of a sudden, as progressive web app support grows, I mean, we're even getting service work on iOS now. I mean,
yay.
Yeah, I know, right? Woo! Like, just joyous. It's a joyous time. But does that make the native containery web that a lot of people probably don't realize they're using, does that make it go away? Like, I question whether it does or not.
See, I have my own opinions on it, in that it doesn't necessarily make it go away, because there's still some things that the browser can't do and probably won't do, and in terms of saying, hey, I want to write a full SQL database to my device. Well, Web SQL's gone, but people still need that. I need a full-fledged SQL database, and I want to be able to write to that. Other features such as dedicated hardware support for, say, USB or Bluetooth. While Chrome may have web Bluetooth, iOS, it doesn't have it, and they indicated that they won't support it. So there are going to be places where these APIs or these containers need to exist because there's no web equivalent API. Another one I just thought of, Touch ID and fingerprint readers. There's no web API for that. So there are going to be places where it's needed.
I think another interesting one is how you ship these things. So for those of us writing software and apps, etc., for enterprise customers that don't have a public-facing portal or site or something like that, how do you deliver them a PWA after you finish creating it without packaging it up into something that you can literally give them? I don't know whether Justin or Mike, you've got any ideas on that kind of front, but obviously a PWA, the add to home screen experience and that kind of stuff, without wrapping it up in a shell and having it installable, how do you give somebody that without it being made public or accessible via a browser?
It's hard.
That's the best way to describe it. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, so you'd need
Yeah.
a shell or something like Capacitor or Cordova or Electron to be able to wrap it up and give it them, right? It's another case for.
There definitely is a case. Like, and again, I'm of the same ilk that I don't think that everything ever goes away. I think platforms stick around a lot longer than people think, which is why we have problems with sort of certain platforms that maybe we shouldn't have used to begin with, but now we're stuck with them 20 years on. This is not an uncommon story, particularly in corporate, where you may have, significant debt. It's not even technical debt; it's just debt. Like
it is severe debt.
Yeah, severe debt that you're going. I don't. And my problem, I have this conversation with younger developers who are just getting in there, like, they're to some extent they're upset about having to see this thing, right? And they're like, I don't understand why they ever ship this. And I'm like, you have to have some empathy, because you're going to be in one of those spots one of these days where you're like, I don't want to ship this, but I have to ship it because that's what we need right now. And it doesn't necessarily make you the happiest person in the entire world, but at the end of the day, you hope it works. So have empathy. By the way, have empathy for other people's code, because it may look like a bad path, and you're like, I don't understand why they did it. There was probably a reason, and there was probably a cursing comment above it, but they had to take that out because you can't have that in the log. I'm not saying any of this from personal experience, but yeah, it's. I think the internal source story is difficult to sort of play out for sure.
Yeah, there's going to be times like totally unrelated to web technology. I still see Python 2 code. And Python 2 was, received its last update not too long ago, but Python 3 has existed for a number of years. Like, you don't think of that as being like, that's technical debt. It's just how things are. And there are entire systems built around, this code that cannot upgrade or cannot change, or it has to be done this way.
And the web app story internally for a lot of folks
Right.
is very similar. Is that, you're going to see the same thing of like, why are you using random jQuery version 1.x? Because that was when it got built and it never got updated, right?
It's like, there's a fun story behind that. There's a plugin that I'm using that depends on another plugin, but those two versions of jQuery don't exist. So we have to depend at 1 point something.
Exactly.
RC3.
RC3. Only RC3, not 2. Don't
Nope.
go to 2. No. Don't go to 4. It'll give you a different number. 3.
It's a sweet spot.
and that's, and again, you hear, or at least I hear these things of, why didn't they maintain it? Why didn't they do things? You don't know, like, business requirements for different companies or different things. And in a perfect world, everything is updated. But again, this goes back to somewhat, I guess, the Smushgate thing, as well as, the idea of the word progressive and the word progressive web app, is that there is a history. Platforms die, but the web sort of expands, right? The web never really dies. It just sort of changes shape over time, which means you really have to be careful about what you decide you want to break, and the sort of things that you want to bring to it, which to y'all's point is that, I think there'll be room for native and the PWAs and everything else.
It's a really deep statement.
Thank you. Yes, I've come to my next podcast where we discuss philosophy of the web. Oh my gosh, what did we do 15 years ago?
I think this is a really good kind of way to go about it, though. You can build this really awesome, really fast performant PWA, which can be used, just in the browser. But then if you need to add to that or deliver it some other way, you can then wrap it in these, different shell-based ecosystems with something like Capacitor, and then you've added to that experience and you can deliver it in a completely different way. But the core of it is that most of the code is the same code on all those different platforms, which is, everybody knows the benefits of that. So I think it's definitely the right direction.
Yeah. And, with the code being, mostly different, it's really just the implementation details under the hood. And most developers will never have to know those implementation details, and they'll just be fine. And they'll be able to ship whatever they want, however they want, and be happy. That's the key point. They'll be happy.
Yeah, what's the build process kind of story or thoughts with Capacitor? Like, how will you take your stuff and then deploy it everywhere? What's the story there?
So we think that native platforms actually have a fairly decent build story. In some ways, better than what the web currently has. Don't at me. But for instance, if you want to build an iOS app, it makes sense to just use Xcode. Xcode has really great debuggers, really great build processes. It's actually kind of not that bad.
Apart from it never works.
We don't talk about those times. Those are the dark times when we make coffee. Android has a similar situation. Like Android Studio is, it is a thing, and it's not awful. But it also has the build tools already provided when you install it. So there's like little to no setup needed. So it just doesn't make sense to create our own build tool system, our own build chain on top of these other build chains. That way we can build something. Why not just remove our build chains and rely on what the actual platform uses? So in this case, for iOS, it just used Xcode, and for Android, it just used Android Studio.
Yeah, there's probably a lot less that can go wrong then, I imagine, because the code over CLI tools often can have versioning issues and all that kind of stuff. So I suppose you kind of cutting out the middleman in a way.
To a degree, yeah. It also, when you have an update to the native platforms, you're not having to go ahead and say, okay, well, iOS just updated, and now the iOS SDK updated, which means now all my build scripts need to be updated to account for these new options. It's like you can do away with all of that and just say, oh, here's iOS, it updated. Okay, I can still go ahead and build because I'm just using whatever iOS uses.
So we're running up against time, as it were. Mike, what other cool things have we particularly missed about Ionic? I mean, I think if there's one takeaway that I think everyone should take away from this, though, is that Ionic has grown quite a bit, for sure. The footprint that y'all have in terms of just beyond the UI, because I think a lot of people may still think, oh, Ionic equals UI. So much more now, so much more. But what cool thing did we miss? What question did we not ask that you probably really wanted to answer?
There is one that I really wish someone asked. Ionic has moved its internal styling to CSS variables. And we've been pretty hush-hush about this, but I've recently fallen in love with CSS variables. So the fact that we're doing that inside of Core now is probably the coolest thing that I've ever had to have the chance to work with.
CSS variables are awesome.
Yes. And also, I think videos will be out later, but one of our own devs who works on Stencil, Josh Thomas, did a great talk on the build process inside of Stencil and how it actually works using the TypeScript compiler. I think TSConf will be uploading those videos, so be on the lookout for that.
We will make sure to get that into the show notes when it goes live.
Yeah.
And yes, CSS variables. Trick stuff.
It is.
So nice. Leon, closing thoughts as we round out episode number 157.
Nothing from me. If you haven't already checked out Ionic and all the amazing stuff they're doing, you definitely should do.
Fantastic. Mike, if people want to find you on the web, where is the best place to look for you?
Best place to look for me is on Twitter at mhartington, and basically that same handle for the rest of the web. I try to be real original.
It's Mike's all the way down. It's all the way down the stick. Just Mike's.
Just Mike's. Just a bunch of Mikes hanging out in a room.
Writing code, trying to make the web better. Well, thanks, Mike, for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And this has been indeed episode number 157 of the Web Platform Podcast. Stay tuned next week when we talk more things web and possibly another gate/reference of how we name things on the web. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your week.